In the 16th century, Russia began a powerful expansion to the east, seizing vast territories in just a century. It quickly became clear that the endless expanses beyond the Urals could be not only a source of valuable furs, but also an ideal place to send all sorts of undesirable elements. Because almost immediately after the pioneers, convoys of exiles also headed east. From that moment and up until the fall of the monarchy in 1917, exile was consistently included in the list of punishments for criminal and political offenses. The harsh Siberian land has seen all kinds of people over the centuries. Ukrainian hetmans and powerful courtiers, captured Swedes and rebellious Poles, Decembrists and future leaders of the Soviet state. So, in this episode, we'll talk about who was sent into Siberian exile and for what reasons, how harsh this punishment was considered, how exile differed from penal servitude, and what conditions the exiles lived in. And of course, you'll learn about the most famous individuals who survived exile in the distant, harsh Siberia. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How They Lived section open. Let's begin. How it all began. Exile as a form of punishment has been known since ancient times. Usually, criminals or simply undesirable people were sent to the outskirts or to colonies. In this way, two problems were solved at once. The central part of the state was freed from criminal or disloyal elements, while new territories received the human resources they needed. For example, in Europe, this type of punishment became widespread in 1516. It was used for centuries and continued until the middle of the last century. The English sent their criminals to Australia and North America. The French sent theirs to French Guiana and New Caledonia. The Russian state was no exception in this regard. Exile to a specific location began to be used in the second half of the 16th century during the reign of Ivan IV Vasilievich. Usually, the place of exile was chosen to be borderlands and towns, where the exiles became farmers or servicemen. It can be added that in those times it was usually wealthy and influential people who were exiled, boyars, voivodes, and royal nobles. Usually, those who would be considered state or political criminals today were sent to Siberia. Participants in uprisings, conspiracies, traitors and spies, impostors, critics of the government's policies and the monarch himself, as well as prisoners of war. After the time of troubles ended, those who supported impostors and then opposed the accession of the Romanovs were sent to Siberia. Among those exiled were voivodes, boyars and princes. In 1593, the first mass exile of ordinary people took place. For the riots and atrocities in Uglich, thousands of residents of this city were sent to western Siberia. Overall, according to the well-known Russian historian Pyotr Budzinsky, from 1593 to 1645, at least 1,500 people were exiled to Siberia. Interestingly, along with the Uglich rioters, the alarm bell that called citizens to the riots was also exiled to Tobolsk. It was thrown down from the bell tower, its tongue was torn out, and it was publicly flogged with a whip. And in 1593, the bell was sent into exile by convict transport. The Tobolsk voivode secured it in the office. An inscription appeared, the first inanimate exile from Uglich. Only 300 years later, with the permission of Alexander III, the bell was pardoned and returned to Uglich. For a long time, exile in Russia was not formalized. In other words, it was not officially included in the list of punishments and was considered only a form of the Tsar's disfavor. Somewhere at the end of the 16th century, exile, or expulsion from the land, as it was written in documents at the time, began to be applied not only to political, but also to common criminals. But again, it was not considered a form of imprisonment, but rather a convenient way to get rid of undesirable people. In those harsh times, exile was not considered too cruel a punishment, especially since it was usually an alternative to the death penalty, as exile became official. Exile received official status in Moscow as early as the 17th century. In 1648, it was included in the legal code of Tsar Alexander Mikhailovich. In this same document, exile to Siberia is mentioned for the first time as a separate type of punishment. Moreover, judging by the decrees of that time, by sending people to the east, the authorities wanted not only to punish criminals, but also to promote the development of the region. Therefore, as early as 1679, permanent exile to Siberia replaced the death penalty for thieves. In 1691, for vagrants and beggars. In the middle of the 17th century, a church schism occurred in Moscow, after which Siberia became a second home for old believers for several centuries. Many of them fled east on their own, but thousands and thousands were forcibly exiled there. The spiritual leader of the old believers, Protopope Avakum, also went to the distant Transbaikal region, along with several of his closest associates. To better understand the scale of the repression, it should be said that in the 1670s and 1680s, old believers made up a third of Yakutsk's population. Exile received its final legal definition during the time of Peter I. Under him, the list of crimes punishable by exile was significantly expanded. For example, now people were exiled to Siberia even for desertion from the army. Peter I sent people to Siberia for trading shoes with tar, for wearing Russian clothes and beards, for illegal alcohol trade, for robbery without murder, and for selling unhealthy food or carrion. You could be sent in a convict transport for drunkenness, playing cards and dice. The first Russian emperor needed the forced labor of exiles not only to develop new lands, but also for other purposes. A galley fleet was being created, and rowers for it were recruited from among criminals. In addition, new prisons were being built on a large scale. State-owned factories were being opened, and mines were established, where forced labor was also required. The conditions in which convicts traveled to their place of exile were extremely harsh. Often, a significant number of them died on the way from hunger, cold, and disease. There is a well-known decree by Peter I where he demands an investigation regarding the boyar's son, Pyotr Meleshkin, who was supposed to deliver 624 people to the place of exile, but managed to bring only 403. Not only Russian subjects, but also citizens of foreign states ended up in Siberian exile. Thus, as a result of the Northern War, about 20,000 Swedes ended up in captivity. Some of them joined the Russian army, but the vast majority was sent to the Ural factories. And only after the Treaty of Nystad was signed, in 1721, did the long process of returning the Swedes to their homeland begin. After the so-called annexation of the left bank Ukraine to Moscow, many Zaporizhian Cossacks who were not loyal enough to the Russian Tsar were sent to Siberia. A new wave of repressions against the Ukrainian Cossacks began during the time of Hetman Mazepa. Many of his associates ended up in Siberia, where they remained until the death of Peter I. Exile and hard labor. At the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, a new type of criminal punishment officially appeared: hard labor. Its history is inextricably linked with the history of exile in the Russian state. The forced labor of convicts had been used before, but it was under Pyotr I that hard labor became part of the empire's system of criminal punishments. In 1705, a special decree was issued by the sovereign, which ordered, instead of the death penalty, to inflict severe punishment, to flog with a whip, and to brand with a new mark, to slit the nostrils and send them to hard labor for life. To brand with a new mark meant to sear the forehead with red-hot iron, and to make sure the brand didn't fade, it was repeatedly rubbed with gunpowder. Originally, hard labor was associated with the construction of fortresses and ships. However, as the metallurgical and mining industries developed in Siberia, convicts began to be sent east as well. The main place of hard labor became the Nerchinsk region, where exiles worked at mining plants, mines, construction sites, and logging. There were special spinning houses for female convicts. Hard labor could be for a fixed term or indefinite. In the latter case, a person worked until death. He could only hope for release due to severe injury or old age. Fixed-term hard labor could be assigned for a period from 1 year to 20 years. After completing their sentence, convicts theoretically had the right to return home, but usually they were ordered to remain in Siberia as settlers. The regulations regarding hard labor changed throughout the 19th century. As a form of punishment, hard labor was abolished only after the February Revolution. The 18th century exile is gaining momentum. The 18th century is an era of conspiracies and palace coups, when the struggle for power among the highest state elite intensifies. Well, where there is struggle, there are always losers. They were the ones sent to settle the vast expanses of Siberia. Among the most prominent names are Peter II's closest associate, Prince Menshikov, the Dolgorukov princes, Empress Anna Ivanovna's favorite, the Duke of Kurland-Biron, and Field Marshal Minich. In the 18th century, the first Russian revolutionary, Radishchev, was also sent to Siberia for his rebellious work. All of them were considered especially dangerous criminals and villains who hated public order. That is why they were kept in Siberia in confinement and under guard. In addition to high-profile individuals, the flow of exiles from the common people increased significantly in the 18th century. And we're not just talking about criminal offenders, but also ordinary people who showed disloyalty to the authorities or simply, as they say, happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Several factors came together here at once. First of all, Empress Yelizaveta Petrovna abolished the death penalty, replacing it with lifelong hard labor, which by itself significantly increased the flow of exiles. And secondly, landowners received from the state the right to send their serfs into exile if they were found guilty of indecent or insolent behavior. And since the degree of indecency and insolence was determined by the landowner himself, in fact, any peasant could end up in Siberia. Not just alone, but with his wife and children. Only thanks to this decree, from 1760 to 1880, according to various estimates, from 40 to 60,000 peasants were sent into exile. The 19th century, from the Decembrists to the Bolsheviks. In the 19th century, exile finally became the main form of punishment in the Russian Empire. If earlier, for minor crimes, people were given a year or two in penal battalions, now they began to be exiled to Siberia for permanent settlement. The poor, vagrants, the disabled, and simply people undesirable to the authorities were sent away in prisoner convoys. The authorities saw exile as a convenient and very cheap way to get rid of troublemakers. Exile made it possible to save money on building and maintaining prisons, not to spend money on police surveillance of suspicious individuals, and to pay for dozens of different punishments. Year after year, the number of exiles grew. If in 1812, 2,035 people were sent to settlement and hard labor, then from 1824 to 1828, more than 11,000 people were exiled to Siberia every year. The flow of exiles increased even more under Alexander II. Although this Russian Tsar was considered a liberal, the number reached 300,000 people. That is, about 15,000 people. Another feature of Siberian exile in the 19th century was the large number of political criminals, people who strongly opposed the authorities and the existing order. It all started with the Decembrists, who staged an unsuccessful uprising in 1825. 120 people from their ranks were sent to Siberia for hard labor or permanent settlement. Then there were participants of the Polish national movement, freedom fighters, Petrashevists, Narodnaya Volya members, and later members of banned leftist political organizations. In various regions of Siberia, Mikhail Frunze, Yakov Sverdlov, Joseph Stalin, and many other prominent revolutionaries, who later became leaders of the Soviet state, were in exile. Each of them received an allowance of 8 rubles a month from the Tsarist government, which was quite enough for a normal life. The future leader of the world proletariat, Vladimir Ulyanov, also spent time in Siberian exile. He lived in the village of Shushenskoye, rented a large peasant house, and had the opportunity to hire servants from among the local residents. Later, Nadezhda Krupskaya came to him as his fiancée. This is not surprising, because political exiles in Tsarist Russia were always in a more privileged position than criminal ones. In general, the total number of people exiled to Siberia from 1807 to 1898 exceeded 86,000. According to the prison administration of the Russian Empire, as of January 1, 1898, there were 309,000 exiles in Siberia and more than 64,000 members of their families. This amounted to about 5.4% of the population of Siberia. The Shackled route, or how people were sent to Siberia by stage transport. The first literary description of the Siberian stage transport system was left by Protopope Avvakum, who was exiled to Tobolsk with his family in 1654. He vividly described the hardships of the journey, even though he was considered a privileged exile, closely acquainted with the Tsar and the Patriarch. He covered most of the way by sleigh and cart. Ordinary exiles, however, had to walk on foot in shackles and stocks. Before the advent of railway communication, the journey into exile took many months and sometimes even years. The return journey required a considerable amount of money, which is why many exiles remained in Siberia even after their sentence was over. For this reason, people did not escape from Siberian exile. To travel alone for several thousand kilometers through deserted places was simply an impossible task. The route from Moscow to Yakutsk along the Siberian road was more than 7,000 versts among the people. This road was called the Shackled Road. The prisoners walked on foot, shackled in leg and hand irons, often connected by a chain. Since the late 17th century, convicts were branded and had their nostrils split. Since 1830, prisoners who were transported to Siberia by convoy stages had half of their heads shaved every month. Up until the middle of the century, there was no provision for food during the journey. The convicts had to feed themselves or beg for alms. Therefore, it's not surprising that those being transported were constantly hungry and died in large numbers from deprivation and disease. The delivery of exiles to Siberia was handled by the Siberian office and later the investigative office. Convicts were sent east irregularly. They traveled under the supervision of a special convoy, which bore full responsibility.
За возможный побег колодников.
Only in the 18th century were stable routes for sending exiles to Siberia established. Prisoners were gathered in Samara or Kaluga and then sent beyond the Urals in the summer. They traveled along the Oka and Volga rivers to Kazan, and from Kazan along the Kama River to Perm. Then they went on foot through the Ural Mountains to Verkhotursky Ostrog, and then through Tobolsk and Tomsk to Irkutsk and Nerchinsk. In the 1830s, there was some humanization of the Russian penal labor system. Prisoners began to be fed and housed under a roof in transit prisons, with men and women separated into different cells, and for female convicts, leg irons were even abolished. Another attempt to soften the rules for convicts was made in the 1860s during the era of reforms under Alexander II. In 1863, corporal punishment was abolished for women being transported to Siberia. In addition, the movement of prisoners on foot was partially replaced by transportation in carts. The real revolution in the transportation of prisoners was brought about only by the railroad. However, it did not reach Siberia right away, and until the end of the 19th century, chained prisoner convoys trudged along Siberian roads just as they did in the old days. A few words in conclusion. We don't know how many convicts and exiles were actually sent to Siberia over the course of nearly 4 centuries. In any case, it was extremely difficult for them, and they lived in inhuman conditions. Most of them weren't even criminals. Overall, it's a very tragic and sad page of history. Well, that's all from me. See you in the next episode. Bye.